Hello, I'm Mrs. Tyler, and today we're going to do a draw along knowledge organiser to revise biology. We're going to be doing one on the nervous system, which is on both dual and triple award GCSE. It's going to look something like this. So we're going to be looking at the basic structure of a nervous system and a reflex arc, synapses, which are the connectors between the neurons, and then having a look at the required practical. As always, all you need is a piece of paper and a pen. The paper needs to be in landscape. If you're doing triple, keep an eye out for the other videos on the brain and the eye. Otherwise, let's get started. All right then, so as always, we're going to start with the title. As always, I'm going to try and get it into the middle. Today, we're doing about the nervous system, which, as I've said, this part of it is on both dual award or combined, and it's also on triple award or separate biology. We're going to divide the page in half. And in quarters on that side, and this side needs to be about 1/4 and 3/4. And we're going to be looking at the structure of the nervous system, we're going to be looking at synapses, which are the joins between the nervous system, we're going to be looking at a reflex arc, or reflex, short. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at the reaction times required practical. So we're going to start then with our nervous system. And it's worth saying that the nervous system, as the name suggests, are made out of cells called neurons that can carry electrical impulses. So nerves are made out of neurons. These can carry electrical impulses quickly. And then we're going to draw a quick gingerbread man. So here's my head. Here's my arms. And then down to his legs. So we're going to start off then thinking about the brain. I'm going to draw the brain here, always looks a bit like a tree, and that attaches directly onto the spinal cord. It's important that you know the difference between the spinal cord and the spine. The spinal cord runs down the middle of the bone. The spine is bone. So you must always put brain and spinal cord. Don't miss off the cord. And together, the brain and spinal cord form the central nervous system. And these, because sometimes the spinal cord, act as the coordinators of responses. We'll come back to that later. Branching off from the spine then, you have lots of long, thin nerves that connect to the rest of the body. Okay, all the way down the spine, branching off, going all the way down to your toes and to your fingertips and right up to the scalp on your head. And this is the peripheral nervous system. And this is made out of long neurons. They can be over 1 meter long. Some of them are sensory neurons, which, as the name suggests, are attached to sense organs or sensors and cells called receptors. So you've got receptors in your skin and in your eyes and up your nose and in your ears. They detect change. We'll be talking more about those later. And we've also got motor neurons. And these attach to muscle. M for muscle, M for motor. Sense for sensory. And they attach to sensors. And the motor neurons are attached to muscles, but the posh word for a muscle is an effector. So that's it, our summary of the nervous system. We've got the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord working as coordinators, making decisions, detecting or taking the response from stimuli and sending impulses to effectors. And we've got the peripheral nervous system, which has long, thin neurons connecting receptors to the central nervous system, then back out again to effectors. On to reflexes then, or reflex arcs. A reflex is a fast, automatic response. And by automatic, we mean we don't think about it. We don't involve the conscious brain. So sometimes they go through the brain, but we're not having a think about it. It's just automatic. We're going to draw out a reflex then, but we're going to do a spinal reflex. So we're going to start by drawing a cross-section of the spinal cord over here. When you cut through the middle of the spinal cord, it looks a bit like a butterfly or a set of lungs. So you're going to draw a butterfly, a set of lungs over here. And in the middle is a layer of darker tissue. I'm just going to draw some dotted lines showing that there. In a reflex arc then, if we're not thinking about a response, it's automatic. We're often acting to protect ourselves. So they are protective. So in this reflex arc, I'm going to draw somebody being hurt. I'm going to draw it on a fingertip. So let's go shoulder, arm. Let's draw a hand here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And back up there. All right then. So we're going to start with the stimulus. And the stimulus is change that is detected. And in this case, if it's a protective one, it could be pain. So in this case, somebody smacked their hand down on a nail. So this is the stimulus. That stimulus then is picked up by a cell in the skin. The cell in the skin is called a receptor. So you have receptors to light in your eyes, sound waves in your ears, chemicals up your nose, and you've got pressure receptors and pain receptors in your skin. Your skin is full of receptor cells, cells that can detect changes. That receptor is linked to a very long nerve that goes all the way from your hand down your arm and into the spinal cord. So that nerve could be over 1 meter long in a single cell. It's attached to a receptor or a sense, so it's called a sensory neuron. Okay, so stimulus is the change, receptor is the cell that detects it, sends an impulse along a sensory neuron here into the spinal cord. Let's just label that. When it gets into the spinal cord then, it can go through a short neuron that's only located in the spine called a relay neuron. And that is part of the central nervous system. So the electrical impulse travels along the sensory neuron into the central nervous system and onto a relay neuron. If it was the eyes that were detecting a stimulus, then the sensory neuron would connect to the brain, but you wouldn't think about it. It would connect in exactly the same way to shorter neurons to bring about a response. This relay neuron then connects to another long one, which comes out and joins onto the effector. And in this case, we need to lift the hand up, away from the pain. So here's our bicep that needs to contract. So number 5 is a motor neuron. And number 6, the muscle, is an effector. So the muscle then contracts, and that contraction is the response. So it's important that you know the 7 steps of a reflex arc. It's quite often fill in the gaps, or it has been a longer answer question. So stimulus, receptor, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, effector, response. And you might be asked for an example of a reflex response. Like we said, they tend to be protective. So it tends to be things like removing a hand from pain, like in our example. Or it could be making your pupils narrower, so constricting your pupils in bright light. So they're reflex responses, fast, automatic, and often protective. On to synapses then. And synapses are connections between the neurons. We said that there are connections between neurons in the central nervous system. So between the sensory neuron and the relay neuron, and the relay neuron and the motor neuron, there are synapses. They can also be found between motor neurons and effectors, but mostly they're found within the central nervous system. So remember then that neurons are long and thin. The long, thin part is called an axon. And the axon can carry an electrical impulse. So here we've got a nerve fibre or an axon, and at the end it's swollen up, and there's a gap between the end of this nerve and the start of the next one. So I'll draw the next one here. This gap is the synapse. So what happens is, as the electrical impulse travels down the neuron, it's travelling fast down the axon, but when it reaches the end, electricity can't jump across this gap, or at least at the voltage that it is inside the body. So instead, it causes chemicals that are stored in vesicles to be released, and they diffuse across the synapse gap and join onto the other side. So chemicals diffuse over the gap. And the fact that they diffuse has been a mark point in the past. So chemicals diffuse across. And when they reach the other side, they bind onto a receptor at the other side and they start another electrical impulse. So a synapse is a gap or a connection between two neurons whereby the impulse is travelling electrically down the first neuron, and it reaches the end, it's changed into a chemical signal that diffuses, binds to the second neuron, and then gets converted back into an electrical impulse so it can pass quickly. These gaps are important because they allow decisions to be made in the central nervous system. And we can change reactions. On to our last one then, and this is the required practical on reaction times. And it's usually the effect of X on reaction time. So it could be the effect of caffeine, it could be the effect of temperature, okay, but remember you can only change one thing per experiment. So you're either giving your subjects caffeine or not, or you're changing the temperature. You can't do both. Okay, so these are the independent variable. I'm going to pretend that I'm going to do caffeine today. The dependent variable then is the thing that I'm going to measure. And we're going to measure reaction time, but in this experiment, we're going to do it by measuring the distance that a ruler drops. It's going to be measured in centimetres. The further it drops, the slower the reaction time. So the longer the distance, slower the reaction time. All right then. So if we were asked to write a method for this, and this has been a 6-mark question in the past, the first thing we need to do is to make it clear that we're going to do repeats, or we're going to do it with a group of individuals. So I'm going to say that I'm going to get 2 groups of people. 2 groups. And I'm going to say I want 10 people in each group. I'm going to make it valid by controlling variables. So I'm going to make sure that the people are the same age, have the same amount of sleep, same amount of food. Then I'm going to ask them to put their arm on the edge of the desk. And I'm going to hold the ruler just above their hand, level with their thumb. And I'm going to ask them to put their fingers 2 centimetres apart, or finger and thumb 2 centimetres apart. And I'm going to hold the ruler with 0 just above the thumb. I'm then going to drop the ruler and record the distance it fell. I'll repeat it with every person because I've got 10 people in my group. But I'm going to I'll calculate a mean distance. I'm then going to give each of my 10 people the same volume of coffee. And then I'm going to repeat the experiment. So the way I'm making this experiment valid is by doing the same age, same amount of sleep, but I'm also keeping the finger and thumb the same distance apart. And the way I'm making it accurate is by doing many repeats and calculating a mean. So that's all for our work on the nervous system. If you're doing dual award, that's it. You've done. If you're doing triple, keep an eye out for my extra videos on the eye and the brain and the control of body temperature. See you next time.